Who were the Abbasids? Who were the Maulas? How did the Abbasids come to power? What is fiqh, sharia, mufti, fatwa, and qadi? What is madhab and qiyas? Who was a Shafi? In the Abbasid Caliphate, what did it mean to say that someone was a Sunni? We mentioned last time that the so-called 5 pillars of Islam were those parts of the Sunnah of Muhammad that pretty much everyone agreed on. Shiite or not, whatever hadith collection you read, however you interpreted the Quran, it was clear that you were expected to testify to God's oneness, Muhammad's prophethood, perform the salat, give the zakat, practice Sawm, the fast, and go on Hajj if you're able. But that's hardly all that the Quran and the Hadith collections expected people to do. There's plenty more, but beyond the 5 pillars, the rest gets a little bit more complicated. Muslims needed to not only read the Quran and the various books on the Hadith, they needed to interpret them. And once you get into the issues of interpretation, things get a lot more confusing. The act of interpreting the Quran and the Sunnah of Muhammad is called fiqh, literally understanding. Sometimes it's translated as Islamic jurisprudence. Fiqh is the attempt of the human mind to figure out what God expects people to do. What is right and wrong, what is required of us, what is forbidden for us. Fiqh is the human mind trying to use the Quran, the Sunnah, and a little bit of reason to deduce and argue for what is the best way to live and the right way to act. Now, fiqh is not just people guessing wildly about what the Quran or some hadith means. It's actually trying to apply these sources in a systematic, regular way. To understand how fiqh came to be, we need to return to Islamic history, and specifically the middle of the 8th century. Muhammad and the first Ummah had now been dead for about 100 years. The Rashidun caliphs have reigned and been replaced by the Umayyad dynasty. And from the beginning of their caliphate, many people were not particularly happy with the Umayyads. We already met the early Shiites, who saw the Umayyads as usurpers to the caliphate. The true rule should have passed to the imams of the Ahl Bayt, the people of the house of Muhammad, specifically those descended from Muhammad's daughter Fatima and her husband Ali. And like in Ali's lifetime 100 years before, the Shiites remained a popular force in what is now Iraq, and the city of Kufa most especially. The people of Kufa remembered well what the Umayyads had done to Hussein, Muhammad's grandson, and decades later, they still felt the same about the Umayyad dynasty. But it wasn't just the Shiites who didn't care for the Umayyads. Many Muslims saw the Umayyads as less than holy people. Many argued that they were Muslims in name only, as it were. The Umayyad family weren't even Muslims until they were forced to be by their circumstances. How can these people now claim rule over the Ummah? And then there were many non-Arabs. Remember how in late antiquity, Arab was not an ethnic group like it is today. Sure, there were Bedouin people who called themselves Arabs, but that was more a style of living than a racial or ethnic identity. And there was a series of languages called Arabic, which was the language of the early Ummah and the Quran. But Arab as a group, apart from others, that you could only be born into, well, that was something of an Umayyad invention. The House of Umayyah, like other people from the Hijaz, spoke the Arabic language. Indeed, they even made Arabic their empire's lingua franca, the language of government and law. But most of the people who lived under the Umayyads were not Arabic speakers, and in no way considered themselves Arabs at all. But now, there was a very real reason to want to speak and read Arabic. It was simultaneously the language of the Quran and of the government. So there was something to be gained by fluency in the Arabic language and Arab cultures. So the question is, how do you learn the Arabic language and learn the ways of Arabic speakers? Well, you have to get an Arab tribe to take you in. These people who were taken in by an Arab tribe are called maulas, clients. These are people who are not natively Arabic speakers in language or Arabian in culture, who learned about Arab culture and language in order to move up the ranks of the Umayyad political system. But the Umayyads, kind of naturally, didn't want people watering down what made them distinct and different. And so the Umayyads drew a line between Arabic speakers. On the one side were the maulas, the people who learned about Arabian culture but were not born into it. And on the other side of the line were people who spoke Arabic from birth and had lived the tribal life of the Arabian peoples. That is, what we now call the ethnic category, Arabs, indigenous members of the Arabian way of life. And of course, the Umayyads favored the group to which they themselves belonged, this now ethnic group called Arabs. And these maulas were, at least to the Umayyads, just second-rate. They were wannabe Arabs. And then, there were people who were unhappy with the economic order of the Umayyads. This most especially concerned the Persians in the region of Khorasan. Now, Persians are not Arabs, although many did become maulas in the first century or two of Islamic history. But the Umayyads always found little ways to remind them that they were less than. The Persian province of Khorasan was perhaps the wealthiest region in the Umayyad Empire. The capital of Khorasan, Merv, was a huge city, one of the greatest in the empire. And beyond this, Khorasan was host to a number of other major cities too. Cities like Nishapur, Herat, and Balkh all completely dwarfed the cities of the Arab lands in both size and wealth. Not only was the land in Khorasan particularly fertile and densely populated, things that the Arab lands were most definitely not, the Persians in Khorasan were on the front lines of the empire. They sat at the edge of the Islamic world, and therefore, as people on the borders of empires always have to do, they're the ones who have to keep the borders secure from outsiders. And so, Khorasan was producing a lot of wealth and doing a lot of fighting, but their cash flow was getting shipped off to the Umayyad capital of Damascus, hundreds of miles away in the Arab lands. The Umayyads were getting all of the benefits of the empire, while the Persian people of Khorasan were doing all of the work. So we have numerous pockets of discontent around the Umayyad Empire, from the Shiites, especially in Kufa, from the various Muslims who didn't think that the Umayyads were worthy of rule, and from non-Arabs all over, most especially the Persians in Khorasan. All that was missing was a spark to set off the powder keg, something to rally around to get all these different groups on the same page. That spark came from the minor town of Humayma in modern Jordan. There was a small family of well-to-do people who claimed descent from Abbas, a paternal uncle of Muhammad himself. Now, Abbas had never become a Muslim, but he did defend his nephew from his enemies while they were alive. In other words, Abbas did what most of the House of Umayyad didn't do. He stood by Muhammad. Plus, Abbas, and now his descendants, were actually related to the Prophet by blood. Sure, they were just distant cousins of Muhammad, but the Umayyads were neither relatives nor allies to the Prophet. And so many people who were discontented with Umayyad rule for any number of reasons could see in these Abbasids, in the family of Abbas, hope for a better dynasty of real Muslims and real members of the Prophet's family. The Abbasids became that rallying point that all of the different anti-Umayyad factions needed. Over in Kufa, the Shiite stronghold, a mysterious military figure named Abu Muslim, literally the father of a Muslim, waged war on the local Umayyad troops. Over in Merv, the capital of Khorasan, open rebellion against the Umayyads started in 747, with dissidents posting the black flags of the House of Abbas over the city. The Umayyad Caliph, Marwan II, tried to crush the symbols of this revolution by imprisoning the eldest member of the Abbasids, Ibrahim ibn Muhammad, who, it seems, was then executed at the caliph's orders. But the death of Ibrahim backfired badly. Abdul Abbas al-Safa, literally the father of Abbas, the bloodshedder, was now the oldest member of the Abbasid house, and he and his family fled from Humayma to join the rebels in Kufa. That is, the symbols of the revolution just joined up with the rebels themselves. And across the empire, people who were disaffected by the Umayyads, Shiites and Maulas, Persians and other non-Arabs, started publicly declaring oaths of loyalty to the Abbasids. Finally, the Umayyad Caliph Marwan led his troops personally into battle to meet the anti-Umayyad forces in January and February of the year 750 at the famous Battle of the River Zab. There, the Umayyads were defeated, and the reign of Abdul Abbas as-Safa and his house, the Abbasids, started. Okay, so what does this have to do with the rise of fiqh and Islamic jurisprudence? Well, everything. When the Umayyads fell in the year 750, people from all over started asking, what does it mean to be a citizen in this empire? It wasn't about being an Arab, because most of the people in the Ummah were not ethnically Arabs. And it wasn't about being allied to this royal house, the Umayyads, because they were just overthrown. So what bound all these people together into one Abbasid empire, if not a royal dynasty or an ethnicity? Well, Islam did. What did all of these people in the Abbasid world have in common? It was their Muslimness. Now, although Muslims were still a minority in this empire, Islam was what the Shiites, the Abbasids, and the Maulas all shared. It was the glue of this new society. And it isn't a coincidence that only after the fall of the Umayyads and the rise of the Abbasids did all of the secondary literatures of Islam that we've been discussing start to appear. The Seerah of Ibn Ishaq was probably finished around the year 760, just 10 years after the Abbasids came to power. The first Hadith collection started to appear in the 790s, during the first generation of Abbasids. All of these documents, the biographical materials on Muhammad and on the first Ummah, and the attempts to find the right Sunnah, all appeared in the Abbasid world, when people were asking, what does it mean to be a Muslim? It isn't about being an Arab. It isn't about aligning with a dynasty. It's about allegiance to God and God's prophet. And so, it follows that Muslims in the Abbasid period started to ask themselves seriously about who Muhammad and his Ummah were, because it told them who they were. Many of the things Muslims wanted or needed to know about how to live required the development of fiqh, the human attempt to understand the way God wants things to go. Now, some of this was just about reconstructing the past, finding the Sunnah of Muhammad. But a lot of it, most of it, went far beyond that. What were the parts of Islam that weren't written in any book or recorded in any hadith? Across the Abbasid Empire, and most especially in the Persian lands, Muslims tried to figure out what exactly was God's way, the Sharia. The word Sharia just means a paved road or a stone street. God from all eternity established a certain way, a Sharia, for things to go. How the universe works, how people are supposed to act. And people don't always know what God's Sharia is. Sure, the Quran and the Sunnah can explain parts of God's Sharia, how God wants things to work. But there are many important matters that either aren't mentioned in the Quran or in the Sunnah, or aren't clear in them. Therefore, people needed to develop systematic methods for using the Quran and the Sunnah, which could clarify obscure matters, rectify apparent contradictions, or explain God's Sharia on issues that don't appear in the revealed and prophetic sources. These various methods of covering Sharia are fiqh, understanding. By the by, Sharia has come into modern English and even non-Islamic circles, usually in the distinctly English construction, Sharia law. Just so you know, this, from nearly all Islamic standpoints, is an odd phrase. First, Sharia is a much bigger category than law. It includes personal etiquette, rituals, and social customs that aren't legally enforced even under the most puritanical Islamic forms of government. Vice versa, Islamic governments issue laws that aren't necessarily considered Sharia. In fact, there are very few Islamic nations that would even claim to be trying to implement God's Sharia legally. There are 50 countries in the world today that have a Muslim majority, and of those 50, only 12 try to implement Sharia legally. And, of course, all 12 of them have very different readings of the Sharia anyway. Yet, all pious Muslims everywhere claim that they are following the Sharia, whether they believe that it has a legal authority or not. So, what are the connections between God's Sharia and the various human attempts to understand it, fiqh, and that thing that we call in English the law? Well, first we have to remember that in the pre-modern world, especially in empires like the Abbasids, the government really didn't have much to do with the lives of most people. Like the Umayyads and the Romans before them, was roughly a collection of urban centers, each with their own governors and fighting forces, which could be mobilized by a single ruler, in this case a caliph, in the case of a war or the need to collect taxes. Otherwise, most people living under the rule of the Abbasid caliphs didn't really have to think much about their government, or even have an abstract concept of law that everyone in the empire supposedly lived under. Islam did intersect with the Abbasid government, though, but in a rather convoluted way. At the local level was the mufti. Roughly, a mufti is someone who a lot of people claim has a very good understanding of the Sharia, the way God wants things to work. No one appointed this mufti, and the mufti does not work for the government. The mufti was just someone who was well versed in the Quran and the Ahadith, and therefore someone whose opinions carried a lot of weight. Think of them like consultants. If you had a question about what to do, whether religiously, legally, or politically, you could ask or employ a mufti to come up with a professional opinion on the matter. These professional opinions are called fatwas. And fatwas are just that, opinions. They have no legal force. If you found the right mufti, or were willing to pay the right mufti, you could get them to issue an opinion for your case. Now, sometimes these fatwas, these opinions, did affect the government, but not directly. Say, for instance, you wanted to get a divorce, and you wanted to take your ex to court to sue for money owed. Now, you could just show up at the court and plead your case. But if you wanted to be safe, you would speak to or hire a mufti, and they would draw up an opinion of why the Quran or the Sunnah of the Prophet agreed with your side of the suit. Now, just because you show up in a court with a mufti's fatwa, that doesn't mean they're definitely going to side with your case. But this mufti and his fatwa could function like an expert witness. The mufti and his opinions of God's Sharia could act as your evidence. Now, in that same courtroom, you would encounter an official of the government, a judge called a qadi. Like judges in modern Western courts, a qadi is supposed to be a neutral party who settles disputes on behalf of a government. The qadi could resolve issues over taxes, property disputes, private construction, wards of the state, public works like bridges or mosques, and he could solve debates over charitable endowments, marriages, or inheritances. Now, these qadis did not have law books that they would have to follow like we do today. For the most part, the Abbasid Empire didn't have long lists of laws. Instead, the qadi, the judge, would consult the fatwas issued by the muftis. They would compare the different opinions of the different muftis, including those of the plaintiff who's standing in front of them, and try to resolve the issue. The qadi could reach out to a mufti who wasn't even involved in the case, if it was commonly believed that that mufti had a particular expertise in the matter at hand. But again, there was nothing to make the qadi agree with the mufti in their fatwa. Indeed, most noteworthy legal cases would involve rival muftis making opposing fatwas. Now, if a fatwa was particularly convincing over many, many years, it could take on a status kind of like our notion of a law. But no pre-modern fatwa was ever binding by its very nature, the way a law is. A fatwa is only followed if a qadi thinks it's worth following. And the practice of what we would call law and the Sharia didn't always necessarily sync up. In fact, they often didn't. Something could be a major issue of the Sharia that is hotly debated by the muftis in their fatwas for many centuries, and yet have no legal bearing at all. For instance, there are multiple ahadith that clearly say that dogs should not be kept in houses. Dogs belong outside of houses because they're work animals, and they aren't particularly clean. So even though it would be very easy to find fatwas written by muftis saying dogs are unclean or shouldn't be allowed in your house, no qadi has ever taken this to mean that someone who has a puppy should be thrown in jail or fined by the government. It may be Sharia, but it's definitely not law. So how do these muftis operate? How do they come up with their fatwas? There are many different schools of fiqh, called madhabs. That is to say, many different muftis who use many different methods to interpret the Sharia differently. And these madhabs are often at odds with each other on important issues. Issues that the Quran and the Sunnah are quite clear on are issues of general matters of Islamic practice. The most famous of these are the ones we met last time, the so-called 5 pillars. Disregarding the rather minor variations of how each pillar is interpreted, no madhab, no school of fiqh, has ever denied their validity as God's Sharia. But fiqh, human understanding of God's Sharia, kicks in when it comes to how one is to practice these 5 pillars, or for that matter, any other practice. For example, the Quran says many, many times that Muslims must pray, and it also gives Muslims the formulas that they must say when they pray. But the Quran never says how often to pray, or when to say which Quranic prayers. And so a mufti has to get to work on the issue. Now, all the schools of fiqh that exist both in the past and today concluded that a Muslim is supposed to pray 5 times a day, at particular times during the day, and facing the Qibla, the direction towards the Kaaba in Mecca, wherever on earth the given Muslim is. But neither the Quran nor the Sunnah ever specifies, just for one example, exactly how far apart are your feet supposed to be when you say your salat. Now, everyone agrees that the salat involves occasionally standing up. But where exactly do you need to place your feet in order to be considered standing? Are your feet supposed to be together? Far apart? Does it even matter? And so, if you're a mufti, how do you figure out where your feet are supposed to be when you're praying? Now, in the early Abbasid period, we meet a man named Ashafi. We think Ashafi was originally from Gaza, but he bounced around this new Abbasid empire and eventually he settled in Egypt, where he ended up dying. Ashafi's big question for himself, and for Muslim practice, was how can we trace every action, moral, and custom back to either the Quran, the Sunnah, or both? How do we know what God wants from us in every and any possible situation? To this, Ashafi developed an ISUII009, a system of using human understanding to discover the Sharia of God, a methodology that you could employ to find the Sharia no matter what your question was. Ashafi starts with the Quran itself. The Quran is God's own revelation to the human race. It, more than anything else, must contain God's will directly. If the Quran says something, that must certainly be what God actually wants. But the Quran doesn't say anything about where to put your feet when you perform the Salat. So next, according to Ashafi, you go to the Sunnah of the Prophet. The Prophet is God's chosen emissary on earth, and the best example of how to live. And how do you find the Sunnah of the Prophet? You look to the Hadith collections. Now, the Prophet is just a person, not God. And besides, you can't always trust that a certain Hadith is reliable. So if the Quran says one thing, and the Sunnah of the Prophet says something else, you always side with the Quran, because that is certainly God's will, His Sharia. Now, in a case like this, if you want to know where you put your feet when performing the Salat, the Quran doesn't say anything at all. So we look to the Sunnah, the collections of Hadith, our second most reliable source of God's Sharia. But there's no Hadith that mentions where you're supposed to put your feet when you stand during the Salat. There are many ahadith that mention that standing is part of the Salat. The Quran mentions that too, but not a single one of these defines what standing means exactly. And so, after the Quran, and then the Sunnah, you can turn to the consensus of the Ummah, the Ijma', what the overwhelming majority of Muslims agree on. If nearly every Muslim is doing something, and it's not found in the Quran or in the Sunnah of Muhammad, there's probably a reason why they all do it. Sure, this isn't as reliable as things explicitly mentioned in the Quran or in the Sunnah, but it's what you have to work with in this case. And sure enough, the vast majority of Muslims perform the standing part of the prayer with their feet roughly in the same position. But how do you create a system out of this observation? Then, Ashafi tells us, you have to use your qiyas, your analogical or deductive reasoning. You take what you know for sure and see how it applies to other situations. If Muslims overwhelmingly tend to stand this way during their prayers, we can create a principle of approximation that tells us how any Muslim ought to stand. So, in the case of Ashafi's followers, his madhab, they concluded that if you weren't sure where to put your feet when standing for the Salat, you can use the width of your own hand as a ruler. That is a measure that any Muslim who has hands and feet can use, and therefore, it can be standardized. Does this mean that performing the standing parts of the Salat with your feet a handspan apart is God's Sharia from all eternity? No, not necessarily. But it is fiqh. It's the human attempt to understand what would please God. So Shafi and his pupils now have a system that you can use in any situation. First, you check the Quran, and if that doesn't work, you check the Sunnah, and if that doesn't work, you check the consensus of Muslims, and if that doesn't work, then you use your qiyas, your ability to deduce by comparison. Following Shafi's methods of systematizing fiqh, many people started coming up with rival models where they disagreed with Shafi's methods but liked how he was thinking. Here are just a few of them. There were many more. Some people created a similar model to Ash-Shafi's using the opinions of people who lived before Ash-Shafi, people like Abu Hanifa, who died a generation before Shafi. These Hanafis, that is, the followers of Abu Hanifa, said that if you want to come to the right decision, you check the Quran, then the Sunnah of the Prophet, and then you use your qiyas, your analogical reasoning skills, and then you look to social customs and personal opinion. The followers of Malik ibn Anas, the Malikis, also looked backwards in time at their teacher and made a system of thought based on a Shafi's. But these Maliki said you start with the Quran and then the Sunnah of Muhammad, but then you use the Sunnah of the people of Medina. Then only after that can you use the consensus of the whole Ummah, followed by Qiyas. And in the future, after a Shafi, followers of the Hadith scholar Ibn Hanbal took Shafi's system and made a couple of revisions in it. These Hanbalites mostly agreed with Shafi, except they thought that you never needed to use your reasoning, your qiyas. If something wasn't clear from the Quran, the Sunnah, and the consensus of the Ummah, then it just wasn't a significant matter. God wouldn't want you to have to guess about anything so important. And the Shiites made systems like this too. For instance, the Jafaris, followers of the Shiite Imam Jafar as-Sadiq, made a system where you check the Quran, then the Sunnah of the Prophet and the Imams together, and then you use your own reasoning. You can see that all of these methods, which muftis still use today when they research and write their fatwas, follow a Shafi's basic principle. We're trying to understand God's Sharia. The only place that without a doubt is explicit of God's Sharia is the Quran. And then after that, there are hierarchies of increasingly less reliable sources that we have to turn to. Now, in the centuries to come, the Shiite school here would get treated a little bit differently than these other four. Because while all five of these groups agree on the Quran's authority, they disagree on the Sunnah. Four of these schools think the only human being whose Sunnah is absolutely to be followed in all situations is the Prophet Muhammad's. The Shiites think the Imam's wisdom must also be taken into account. And so, the members of these four madhabs, the Shafis, the Hanafis, the Malikis, and the Hanbalis, were the people who agreed that the only human authority you can always trust is Muhammad's. And so, these four groups together were dubbed the Ahl Sunnah, the people of the Sunnah, or the Sunnis. The term Sunni came to refer to anyone from any of these four schools who didn't think that the Imams had an authority like the Prophet's Sunnah did. But in time, especially today, the term Sunni is used a little bit more loosely. Nowadays, when you say someone is a Sunni Muslim, that's to say that they are either a follower of one of these four madhabs, or they at least agree with these four schools that the only human authority that you should always trust is Muhammad. In other words, while in the Abbasid period a Sunni was someone who belonged to the Shafi, Hanafi, Maliki, or Hanbali schools of fiqh, these days it's more formal to refer to any Muslim who isn't a Shiite as a Sunni. Who are the Abbasids? Who were the Maulas? How did the Abbasids come to power? What is fiqh, sharia, mufti, fatwa, and qadi? What is madhab and qiyas? Who was a Shafi? In the Abbasid Caliphate, what did it mean to say that someone was a Sunni?